recording. Good evening, everybody. We are starting and ending. Today is only one session for the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a prophet, and this is, let me put him in context of the timeline, right, where you have the king of Judah, the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel has gone into exile. So by this time, these are the last few kings of the southern kingdom. You have Josiah during the period of 640 to 609 BC. And there are three prophets ministering during his time. Zephaniah, we have finished. And then Jeremiah is the second one to come along at 627 BC, and Habakkuk at roughly 620, but we are not very certain. We'll talk about that in a while. Okay, so actually we have finished Zephaniah and we should be doing Jeremiah. But because Habakkuk is a very short book, okay, he comes after Jeremiah has started. But since Habakkuk is a short book, we shall finish him first before we go on to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah himself, this prophet, will minister all the way through the remaining kings, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, until Zedekiah, the last king, at 586 before they go into exile. And then somewhere along the line, Ezekiel at 593 BC will enter into the Bible story. Ezekiel will enter into the Bible story with the perspective from the Babylonian exile because he is carried into exile. So let's talk about the dates of Habakkuk's prophecy estimated. Now you will see here that there is another estimate of 612 to 605 compared to the one I gave you earlier at 620 to 610, because the different sources tell us that exact dating is not possible because Habakkuk does not give us any information to show us exactly when he was prophesying. Okay, but we do have certain clues to estimate the period. Okay, so one clue is the Assyrian Empire had recently fallen. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, and Nahum, the prophet, prophesied the fall sometime between 663 and 612 BC. So somewhere along that period, Babylon was rising in power and becoming the dominant empire. And then Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 6 also refers to the Babylonians, or another reference is called Chaldeans. And they are God's instrument of judgment, which suggests that Babylon was already known as a threat at that point in time that Habakkuk was active. And Jerusalem had not yet been destroyed. That would be 586 BC. And his prophecy comes before that because he talks about Babylonian coming to destroy Jerusalem. So obviously cannot be 586, right? And so Habakkuk's prophecy likely was just before or around the Battle of Carchemish, which is 605 BC, when Babylon defeated Egypt and became dominant, the dominant world power at that time. So roughly, you can see that people give him the period close to 605 BC. Okay, 610, 605, that's the estimate that the limit of his prophecy. So he is likely a contemporary of King Jehoiakim, 609, okay, which is also possibly the tail end of Josiah's reign, because these two Jehoahaz was king only for 3 months, so it could very well be roughly any time end of Josiah's period. Okay, so let's go into the book itself. Before 605 BC, Habakkuk cries out to God against violence and injustice in chapter 1, and then God gives him an answer that God is raising Babylon as judgment for that violence and injustice, also in chapter 1. But then Habakkuk has a problem. Why do you use wicked Babylon? Okay, then God answers in chapter 2 is that the righteous will live by faith. And then God will go on to 5 woes, judgment on the arrogant and corrupt. And then that's chapter 2. And then there's a final prayer, which is Habakkuk's response to God, to what God has to say in his poetic theophany and his trust in God in chapter 3. So just 3 short chapters. So what is the story or the message about Habakkuk? Well, he is wrestling with the issue of God using evil nations to punish God's people. So that is a kind of like a puzzle that he just cannot figure out. And ultimately, he trusts in God's work of justice and timing. So he cannot fully understand what God is doing, but he chooses to trust. Talking about his name, Habakkuk, this is what the Hebrew looks like. And it's actually pronounced as Habakkuk. Okay, the B in Hebrew, when you translate into English, actually it comes from the letter V, the sound. So Habakkuk is more likely the correct pronunciation. The B is actually a V sound, and that would be the same for Abraham. It would probably be Avraham or Avraham. Okay. So the spelling for B in our English, in Hebrew, they will pronounce it as a V. So it's probably Habakkuk. Now, the root verb of his name, okay, in Hebrew means to embrace, to cling to or to hold tightly. And so this name, Habakkuk, is quite interesting because it can mean the active sense of someone who embraces or the passive sense of someone who is embraced. So that is quite an unusual name that can cover both meanings. So we talk about this symbolic meaning by the church fathers and scholars who interpreted this name symbolically in the light of his message. He is one who embraces, because Habakkuk embraces God in faith, even while he's struggling, wrestling with confusion and judgment. And he is also the embraced one, where God embraces him in his struggle, which represents intimacy with and trust in God amid the turmoil, amid the confusion. Right? So his name is very interesting because it can be he embraces God as God also embraces him. Okay, so let's move directly now to the book of Habakkuk. First complaints, 4 verses. Why does God tolerate injustice? So he opens with a lament over Judah's injustice. From verse 1, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? All the dot 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 means I take out some of the words to focus on the key message, okay? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing before me? So he's actually observing it. He's an observer. There's strife going on and conflict abounds. So, message and meaning. What's important here is that we can relate to Habakkuk because many people struggle with an issue that they or also we don't understand. And Habakkuk also has this burden, same like us struggling. And he voices a complaint. Why? How long must I call for help, but you don't listen? So he is weary of unanswered prayers. He has been praying for a long time and asking God, and he is also witnessing increasing violence in society. Just like in the world today, we are seeing more and more violence. How long echoes the Psalms? Okay, so in Psalm 13, verse 1, you find that they also ask the question, how long God? Seems like God has forgotten the psalmist. So his lament reflects the internal corruption in Judah before the Babylonian invasion. You can refer to 2 Kings 23 up to 24. So he sees and he struggles with divine inaction. God doesn't seem to be doing anything. Why does God let sin, oppression, and strife persist? So, like Habakkuk, we can cry out honestly to God. Faith in God includes wrestling with what we don't understand, such as why God remains silent about violence and injustice. Then we may have to wait for his answer while not becoming numb to evil or letting ourselves become hardened and then we go on to give in and commit evil ourselves. We say, oh, if God is not going to stop evil people, then I might as well go ahead and commit evil. Yeah, if God is not stopping them, then God shouldn't stop me lah. So we have to be very careful, wait for God's answer. And then in verse 4, he says, because of what's happening, the law, therefore, is paralyzed and justice never prevails. In fact, justice is perverted. What this means is he's saying that the law, or the word in Hebrew is Torah, is ineffective in society. It doesn't work because people are not following it. Corrupt leadership has led to a broken justice system. People have God's law, just like people have God's Bible, but they don't follow it. Example, Jeremiah 22, you will find that Jehoiakim, right, the king is rebuked for exploiting and oppressing people. So even the king himself doesn't follow God's law and he takes advantage of people. Going on to verses 5 to 11, God gives him the first answer. And it is a shocking answer. God says the Babylonians are coming as judgment. You want justice? Okay, I'm giving you justice through the Babylonians. And so this is the answer. Look at, okay, I paused because the connection is unstable. So it said, look at the nations and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people. They are a feared and dreaded people, a law to themselves. Their horses are faster than leopards. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour, intent on violence. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So they are the ones who do wrong thing. They are guilty. Well, God answers Habakkuk at last. He's been praying for a long time. He said, how long? But you do not listen. So now God answers, and you see that God is not angry with Habakkuk for asking these questions. But his plan that he reveals will shock the prophet. See, utterly amazed. This word amazed in Hebrew, tama, is a response of astonishment and horror. God works in unexpected ways, telling him, you will be utterly horrified by what I'm going to do. And God works in unexpected ways, even through pagan powers. No, and God works such as when his own people, especially his leaders, do not carry out this work. And so one lesson that we can actually learn is that when Christians fail to obey God, God can still use non-Christians for his purpose as well. God is not held ransom by our failure to obey him. So it means that if we don't obey God, God is helpless, and so therefore God must please us. Yeah, he's not held ransom by our failure to obey him. We cannot force God. We cannot bargain with God. Say, God, I obey you, then you do this thing for me. Okay, I do the right thing, then you do this for me. We can't force God to do that because God cannot be forced to work that way. So we have no reason to be prideful when you say, see, God needs me. Without me, God cannot do it. Yeah, so we have no reason to be prideful when we obey. Yeah, God can use us. If we don't obey, God can still work in another way, including using non-Christians. He can still achieve his judgment and other purposes. So here, the Babylon is described as ruthless and swift, very fast moving people, a terrifying instrument of judgment. God can and does use evil empires for his purpose of justice. Now, they may not be just people themselves, but what they do can still accomplish God's purposes that people cannot imagine, people cannot believe. In fact, they are going to be horrified, amazed, and horrified. Now, these people, the Babylonians, act independently, governed by their own might, not by moral law. So they didn't follow a set of rules that everybody follows. They do what they want because they are powerful. So we can see that a lot of people are just like Babylonians. They act according to their power and their pride, their ability, with no need to care about other people or even God. So using vivid, very clear metaphors like horses, eagles, all this, show us the speed, the power, and the terror of Babylon. Their motivation is plunder, right? And they destroy and they are violent. In other words, they are not noble conquerors. And Jeremiah 25, verses 9 to 11 will give us an idea that their conquest of Judah will be brutal. They're not gentle, not noble people. No human power or authority is great or able enough to resist Babylon. They dominate all opposition. Nobody can defeat them at this point. Earthly status offers no protection. And what is more, because they know they are powerful, they idolize their own power in self-worship. So they treat themselves as their God. The strength is their God. Their pride will be their downfall in time, and pride and self-reliance are idols because they puff us up to think and to act highly about ourselves. And at the same time, they also blind us to the truth that we are just cosmic dust in a universe. We're just one speck of dust in a huge universe we cannot even begin to imagine. Can you see how we are so puffed up? We think so greatly about ourselves because we have power to attack and overwhelm other people. But in the whole universe of existence, we're just a piece of dust. But, in an imperfect and violent world like ours, filled by human sin, God may permit evil that is an outcome of human choice and action all the way back to Adam and Eve. God may permit evil for greater purposes of judgment and correction. Now, something very important is this, okay? God permitting evil because he has a purpose of judgment and correction. So we will be looking at that over Habakkuk and also Jeremiah's ministry. Yeah? But it shows us that God does not condone the wrong things, this human sin, but at the same time, he works with our human choices and actions to fulfill results with his greater purpose. So God has this sovereign ability to do something of a greater purpose, even though humans sin. So with this first answer, Habakkuk is not quite happy and he makes a second complaint from verses 12 to 17. How can God use a wicked nation to judge us? That is mind-boggling. So we see him struggling with human perception of apparent unfairness. It's not fair. And it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. So in verse 12, he goes, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. So you have chosen them to punish. But then your eyes are too pure to look at evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate these treacherous people? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks, catches them in his net, gathers up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? So Habakkuk asks, are you going to let them keep on doing this kind of evil to nations? So very mind-boggling struggle for Habakkuk. But you see his response, he starts his complaint first of all by reaffirming God's eternal nature. God, you are this. And he declares that God is immortal. God never dies. He's everlasting and never dies. And his unchanging nature, meaning that God, you are eternal and you cannot be destroyed. You cannot die. You cannot be defeated like human rulers. Babylon, though powerful, is not eternal, but it will eventually fall. So Habakkuk struggles with the question and the paradox. How can the holy God use a corrupt nation, particularly to punish? Because you see, Babylon themselves deserve to be punished, yet they are being used to punish God's own people. How does this make sense? Habakkuk struggles not with doubt, but understanding faith. Okay, his faith that needs understanding, he struggles with that amid confusion. So very similar to many Christians who have a lot of challenges, questions, and doubts. The immortality of God is central to his role as the righteous judge. Because he lives forever, he can continue to remain a consistent judge. And it is unthinkable to Habakkuk that the just God will tolerate and even let the treacherous Babylonians, who are worse than his own people, punish his people. How can someone who is more evil punish another party who is less evil? This is humanly confusing and unthinkable. You see, God made people like fish in the sea. Yeah, so people are helpless, they are unprotected, just like fish without defense. So in the same way, Judah was vulnerable and powerless before Babylon's might, just like fish can be easily caught and really caught with hooks and nets. So Babylon's violence is like the sweep of a fisherman's net. You know, the fisherman drops the net into the sea and just drags it like a drag net to catch all the fish. Indiscriminate and brutal. It's not gentle. They just catch anything and everything. And that's how Babylon took nations into exile. And Babylon glorifies their tools of conquest, their military might. They are very powerful. So that becomes their God and enables them to live well. So Habakkuk asks, God, will you let evil prevail endlessly and let Babylon get away with it? So you can see in this chapter 1, Habakkuk struggles with the moral tension. How can it be right that God's holiness appears at odds, somehow conflicts with his means of discipline? Holy God, but the way he disciplines people, he uses wicked people. So this faith struggle is living in the tension between current human injustice and God's promise. Yeah, people do all wrong things and God promises justice. So in chapter 2, he continues to wait for God's answer. So that's why you see it can take quite a few years. His conversation is not like, God, I pray to you today and answer comes tomorrow. Now, not so fast, right? It takes a number of years. So patience and faith in the troubled, questioning heart. That is the importance for us to realize. Okay, God may not answer us for a long time, such as for years, like what probably happened with Habakkuk. So he says, I will stand at my watch to see what God will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. So Habakkuk positions himself like a watchman, somebody looking out, ready for God's answer. And so it shows his expectation and submission, and he's not just complaining. He looks for an answer to an issue, and he's willing to trust in God and wait. So you can see he's developing the quality of faith and perseverance. Faith means waiting with vigilance and not passive doubt, right? We are doubtful, but Habakkuk here doesn't have doubt, but he waits. He's very confused. When we don't get the answers to what we want or ask, do we lose patience and do we lose faith? Or do we throw in the towel, give up, and say, okay, let me just live as the world does, lah, huh? People are not nice, so I will also be not nice. Tit for tat. Yeah, they are not nice people, I will also be not nice. And then God answers him, writes down the revelation so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. So God tells him to record the revelation, and that's where we have our Bible book, right? Habakkuk. He wants the vision to be made clear and public, so urgent and legible that it can be spread quickly. Not just talking, but write it down and people can make copies and spread it around. He wants his people to know, understand, and proclaim his word and not let it be hidden, unknown, or ambiguous. And it therefore affirms another important reason for studying scripture, studying the Bible together, because we look for answers and reasonable faith. Faith that makes reasonable sense. Okay, so God assures that the vision will come, the revelation awaits an appointed time, the Babylonians coming. It may be delayed, but it's certain, for sure it will happen. A key verse on the appointed timing of God's justice. Okay, so you see the idea of appointed time is to say that God has his schedule, what we call kairos time, right? Kairos means the time when God achieves the significant purpose. God achieves the significant purpose, kairos time. The end, such as Babylon's own eventual fall, will also come. And that is fulfilled in Jeremiah's detailed prophecy when you refer to Jeremiah 50 and 51. So the lesson for us, don't lose faith when justice seems delayed or justice is delayed in our perspective. We are kind of like impatient. God, quick judge. God's promises follow his schedule. And we need to know what God has to say and trust he will fulfill. God's answer, verses 4 and 5, the righteous will live by faith. So it will show us that God has a use for even injustice. Okay, so he says, see, the enemy is puffed up, prideful, arrogant. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. So here God contrasts two types of people, the proud, the puffed up person, the Babylonian, versus the faithful, which is the righteous. So the proud will be self-righteous, but the truly righteous person will live and be sustained by his faith, even when evil seems to prevail. So each of these two types of people, each of them is being tested. So God uses injustice to test and refine faith and righteousness. Okay, so this is an interesting concept perhaps for us to wrap our minds around. Okay, the fact that there is injustice, God is allowing people to prove whether they have faith, whether they are prideful and self-righteous, they do things according to themselves as the standard, and they decide what is right, what is wrong. Or people will truly be righteous to live by faith and to choose God's way. Okay, so each is being tested. So that shows again God's patience. Yeah, it shows God's patience even as God waits and God tests people. And that's also a test for us to see how we will continue to be faithful and righteous. And God goes on, indeed, wine betrays him. So which category do we follow and fall into? The proud. Wine betrays him. He's arrogant and never at rest. He's as greedy as the grave and like death, never satisfied. He takes captive all the people, so he can bully and he can attack people because of his arrogance, and he's never satisfied. So Babylon is compared to a drunkard, restless, greedy, devouring without satisfaction. So these are very strong qualities. You see how restless, greedy, without satisfaction, right, comes in to describe and identify the proud self-righteous. When God, or when people rather, don't seek their true creation and life purpose, their life pursuits will be restless and endless, trying to, but failing to find satisfaction, and they even end up hurting others in the process. That can be the non-Christian, that can also be some Christians. Yeah, and some Christians who still do not understand their true creation and life purpose, and their life is restless, endless, failing to be satisfied, and hurting people in the process of what they are doing. Greed and pride are never satisfied. So beware of being a soul that endlessly seeks more. From verses 6 to 20, God talks about 5 woes against the oppressor Babylon. Okay, and so we're going to see many things people do to fulfill themselves, inflict evil and suffering on each other. So they do wrong things and hurt others and cause others to suffer, and in turn they themselves will also suffer. Okay, so we're going to look at 5 woes that God talks about. Woe number 1 from verses 6 to 8 is extortion and plunder, showing that the evil you do to a fellow man will be done to you by fellow men. So will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods, right? So this is the bad person who steals and victimizes and makes himself wealthy by extortion. Will not your creditors suddenly wake up, and then you will become their prey, right? So those that you pick on, one day they suddenly pick on you because you have plundered, you have robbed, you have been violent, you have plundered nation, peoples, left, those will plunder you. Those that are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So this part here, God condemns Babylon for plundering nations through debt, extortion, and violence, and the plunderer himself will be plundered. And that will be fulfilled when Babylon falls to Persia in 539 BC, just as prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 13. So we see that injustice eventually turns on itself. They will suffer injustice themselves. And those who commit evil and wrong to others find evil and wrong coming back on themselves because evil begets evil. People do wrong things to the other people will do wrong things to them. So it will keep on as a vicious cycle going on and on. Right? So this, you have shed human blood. You can see that this is the order of a world wrecked, okay, failed and damaged. This, I use two wrecked. Okay, this one is filled with sin and damaged with sin. Both of God's people and those who are not his people, they are also inside this order of causing sin and being damaged by sin themselves. Then verses 9 to 11, second woe is greedy ambition and security through evil. So in verse 9, you see that woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain. Okay. And then he sets his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. So he tries to prevent justice to himself. Yeah. Justice having to face his crimes. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house, forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall of your house will cry out. The beams of the woodwork will echo it. But this is very unusual, right? Because God says here in this woe, the acts of evil to fellow men leave imprints. They leave imprints in the life of the perpetrator, the person who commits the evil, as well as creation. So something very unique because it's something that we don't experience. This part here, God condemns their exploitative, dishonest, unjust building of wealth, right? They unjust gain, they take advantage of people, and then they find ways to be secure and escape justice or retribution coming back to them. They set their nest on high to escape. Then the wicked schemes of such people, they may ruin other people, but you know what they don't realize is it also brings shame to their name, their family name, and cause them to deserve death. Romans 6:23 tells us wages of sin is death. They deserve to die. So what happens here is the metaphor, stones of their homes will cry out. So you'll see there, the stones of the wall, okay, as their own house, the walls of their own house that they build, right? Settling his nest, who builds his house. Yeah, builds his house. They shame their own house, and the stones of the wall will cry out. The stones of their homes will cry out, and that personifies, makes it look like the stones are actually human beings. They personify inanimate materials, the stones, where not living things, become witnesses to the injustice committed in acquiring these things, or their plunder, or their unjust gain. Okay, they become witnesses. An idea that even lifeless things testify to the violence and bloodshed behind their construction, behind how you get them, right? And it's something not totally strange, because in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, it tells us that Abel's blood cries out to God from the ground, that he is murdered by Cain. Right? So very interesting that the blood can cry out from the ground to God, something we human beings cannot hear. But it shows us injustice leaves a mark on everything it touches. It can be the bricks and the wood, and they remember the bloodshed. It emphasizes that no evil deed is truly hidden. Okay, no evil deed is truly hidden. Creation itself becomes a witness, something very unusual. Creation becomes a witness against those who exploit, oppress, and ruin others. And it highlights the inescapable nature of God's omniscience. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, okay, all-knowing God, and justice. Because even the non-living things can tell God, God, injustice, I've been murdered. You cannot hide guilt behind stone walls. It also reminds us that sin affects creation, which itself becomes subject to corruption and decay. And that is what Romans 8:20-21 says. Creation has been subjected to corruption and decay because of human sin. Going on to verses 12 to 14, woe number 3, violence and bloodshed for glory. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed, so by killing people, yes, and establishes a town by injustice. They do all the wrong things and the godless things to start off. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, is useless, it's just going to be burnt up, all the efforts, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? So all the hard work and effort they put in is just all burnt up. All burnt up, it's all useless. It doesn't achieve anything mighty. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. What it tells us is human effort will be judged based on the knowledge and glory of God as the standard. Remember, we talked about sin. Sin is the high standard of glory that God wants for heaven to be heaven without suffering and pain. But our human effort is sin. It falls short. It doesn't reach that standard. So human effort will be judged based on this knowledge and glory of God as the standard. And that's how their labor is only fuel for the fire. It's all useless. Because Babylon builds its cities with blood, they kill people. The efforts of people who build or accomplish through injustice and godlessness will be burnt up by God. A little bit similar to that is 1 Corinthians 3, verses 12 to 14, telling us